You're a liar, Elise.
I had spent 7 years building that place, training the horses, running the therapy programs, showing up before sunrise and leaving after dark. And in the span of 10 minutes, my father destroyed all of it with 4 words: "You're a liar, Elise." It happened at our biggest fundraiser of the year. Orion, the therapy horse I had spent 2 years gentling from the ground up, suddenly broke loose and ran straight into a crowd of guests. When staff rushed to check the barn, they found my access card on the floor of the medication room and a missing vial of sedative. Mallory stood next to my father, crying, while my mother looked away. No one gave me a chance to speak. They just pointed at the door. What they didn't know was that one camera had caught everything. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by the people who were supposed to know you best, stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of the story. Before that night, I thought the hardest thing I would ever do at Willow Bend was convince a traumatized 8-year-old that Orion wasn't going to hurt him. The boy had stood at the fence for 40 minutes, fingers wrapped around the rail, not moving. I didn't push. I just stayed close to Orion, kept my hand on his neck, and talked to the boy about nothing in particular until he finally reached through the fence and touched the horse's nose on his own. That was the kind of work Willow Bend was built for, and it was the kind of work I had given everything to protect. My parents, Peter and Joanna Merritt, started the center after my older brother Danny went through a therapeutic riding program following his accident. He had lost most of the mobility in his left side, and the doctors weren't optimistic, but something about working with horses changed the way his body and mind communicated with each other. By the time he passed a few years later from something unrelated, he had gotten back more than anyone expected. My parents built Willow Bend in his memory, and when I graduated with my certification in equine-assisted therapy, there was never really a question of where I was going. I turned down a position at a large facility in Louisville and came home instead. For 7 years, I ran the therapy programs, managed the herd, trained the volunteers, and handled the kind of administrative detail work that nobody sees but everybody benefits from. I was the one who drove to the vet supply at 6 in the morning when we ran low on medication. I was the one who stayed after hours to reevaluate a horse that had shown signs of stress during a session. My parents were the founders, the faces, the names on the brochure, and I didn't resent that. I understood that was how it worked. What I didn't understand, not until much later, was how invisible that dynamic had made me in their eyes. Orion was the best example of what I mean. I had found him at an auction when he was 4 years old, undersized, skittish, and completely shut down to human contact. The seller told me he was unworkable, and maybe he was right by conventional standards. But I saw something in the way Orion held himself, the way his ears tracked sound, even when his body went still. And I spent the next 2 years proving that observation correct. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't clean, and there were mornings I walked away from that barn with bruises I didn't tell anyone about. But eventually, Orion learned that my presence meant safety, and from that point forward, he became the most dependable therapy horse we had. My father used to say Orion only listened to me because we were both too stubborn to quit. He meant it as a joke. I think it was actually the truest thing he ever said about us. Mallory Keene arrived in the middle of all this about 14 months before the fundraiser. She was 25, my mother's niece from her sister's side, and she had just lost her marketing job in Nashville. My parents offered her the guest house behind the center and a role overseeing social media and donor outreach. I didn't object. Willow Bend genuinely needed help on that side of things, and Mallory was, by any measure, good at it. Within a few weeks, she had redesigned our online presence, launched a donor newsletter, and secured 2 new sponsorships. My father called her a breath of fresh air at a staff meeting, and everyone nodded. And I nodded too, because at the time I believed it. What I noticed first was small enough that I dismissed it. A donor called asking about a receipt for a cash contribution he had made at our spring luncheon. I pulled the records and couldn't find the entry. I assumed it was a logging error. Mallory was still learning our system, and these things happened. I flagged it for her, and she apologized and said she'd look into it. But then a second donor called, and then a third, and when I went back through the records from the last 3 events, I found a pattern of cash contributions that had been received and confirmed but never deposited into the center's account. I went to Mallory directly before I said anything to my parents. I asked her to send me the full donor tracking file for the past quarter. She said the spreadsheet had corrupted, and she was working with the accountant to reconstruct it. I gave her a week. A week later, she said the accountant had the file but hadn't sent it back yet. I asked for the accountant's contact information so I could follow up myself, and Mallory's response shifted just slightly. Something in her tone not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to start paying closer attention. Around the same time, I was doing a routine medication inventory and found that several vials of sedative were unaccounted for. These were controlled substances with strict documentation requirements. Every dose had to be logged against a specific horse and signed off by our supervising veterinarian. The missing vials had no corresponding entries. I checked the access log for the medication storage room and found that Mallory's keycard had been used there on 3 separate evenings after the center closed on dates that aligned with the missing entries. I also discovered during this period that the security monitor in the main office had been damaged in a lightning strike several months earlier and never repaired. The person who had set up our original surveillance system was Russell Beck, our former maintenance supervisor, who had left the center after a falling out with my father over budget allocations for equipment upkeep. Nobody currently on staff knew how the old system was configured. I made a note of that and kept moving. When I brought everything to my parents, the missing deposits, the medication discrepancies, the access log, I tried to be careful about how I framed it. I wasn't accusing anyone. I was presenting information that needed to be investigated. My father listened with the expression he gets when he's decided the outcome before you finish speaking. When I was done, he said I was under a lot of stress, and that numbers sometimes looked suspicious when you were already looking for problems. My mother was gentler about it, but the message was the same: I should step back, let Mallory do her job, and stop treating every administrative gap like evidence of something sinister. Mallory, for her part, handled it perfectly. She came to my parents before I even left the building, told them she understood why I might feel threatened by someone new taking on responsibilities that had previously fallen to me, and assured them she had nothing to hide. She offered to do a full review of her records as soon as the accountant returned the file. My father thanked her. My mother said she appreciated how maturely Mallory was handling a difficult situation. I drove home that night understanding something I hadn't fully accepted before, that in my parents' eyes I had become the problem. The fundraiser was scheduled for the following month. It was the largest event Willow Bend had hosted in years, with ticket sales and corporate sponsorships that Mallory had spent weeks organizing. There were over 200 guests, reporters from 2 local outlets, and a silent auction that was supposed to raise enough to fund a full year of subsidized sessions for children who couldn't afford the program. I spent the days leading up to it, doing what I always did, making sure the horses were prepared, the facility was safe, the volunteers were briefed. I told myself that whatever was happening with the money and the medication could wait until after the event. I told myself I would find a way to prove what I suspected without tearing the family apart. The evening started well enough. Guests moved through the property in small groups. The horses were calm, and the early auction numbers were strong. I was in the barn doing a final check on the herd when I heard the shouting start. I came out into the main path and saw people scattering, and then I saw Orion. He was moving fast toward the guest reception area, his eyes wide and his stride wrong in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I had seen Orion frightened before. This wasn't that. His movements were too loose, too uncoordinated, like something was misfiring between his brain and his legs. I ran toward him and called his name the way I always did, low and steady, and he slowed enough for me to get close and get a hand on him. By the time I had him stopped, guests were pressed against the fences on both sides of the path, and someone was calling for help on a radio. I got Orion back to the barn and did a quick physical check. His pupils were uneven. His response time was off. Whatever was in his system, it wasn't a small amount, and it hadn't been administered correctly. When the staff checked the medication storage room, the door was unlocked. One vial of sedative was gone with no corresponding log entry, and on the floor, just inside the doorway, someone found my access card. I hadn't used that card in the medication room that evening. I had left it in the locked top drawer of my desk before the event started, the same place I kept it every night after hours. I said that out loud clearly to whoever was listening. Nobody appeared to find it particularly relevant. Mallory found my parents before I could. By the time I reached the main hall, she was already with them, speaking quietly, one hand resting on my mother's arm. When I walked in, she looked at me with something that I can only describe as rehearsed sadness, the expression of someone who had been preparing for this moment and knew exactly what they needed it to look like. "She's been trying to get rid of me for months," Mallory said, her voice breaking just enough. I didn't want to believe she would actually do something like this. But the card was right there. My father turned to me and I saw in his face that the decision had already been made. Not in that moment, maybe not even that evening, but somewhere along the way, without my knowledge, the scales had tipped, and I had been found wanting. "You put guests in danger tonight," he said. "You put Orion in danger, and now you're going to stand here and tell me it wasn't you." I told him about the drawer, about the lock, about the fact that I had been checking horses at the other end of the barn when the incident started. I told him to look at the access log timestamps, to talk to the volunteers who had seen me, to consider for one moment that someone else might have a reason to use my card instead of their own. My mother was looking at the floor. My father was shaking his head before I finished speaking. He announced to the remaining staff that I was being suspended pending a full internal review. He said it in the tone of someone who has already completed the review. I looked at my mother one more time, waiting for something, a question, a look, anything that suggested she wasn't certain. She put her hand on my father's arm and said nothing. I went to my office and took the things that were mine. My certification binder. A photograph of Danny from the year before he died. A small wooden box that had been on my desk since my first week at the center. I set my full key ring on the desk, barn keys, office keys, the master key I had held for 7 years, and I walked out through the side entrance so I wouldn't have to pass through the main hall again. No one came after me. Not my father, not my mother, not a single person whose name I had written on the volunteer training schedule, whose child I had helped learn to trust an animal for the first time, whose donation I had personally acknowledged and filed. I got in my car and drove away from the only place I had ever really thought of as mine, and the worst part wasn't the anger. The worst part was that some part of me had seen it coming, and I had stayed anyway. The apartment above the feed store in Georgetown had one window that faced the parking lot, and walls thin enough that I could hear the woman downstairs watching television until midnight. I had found it through a listing posted on a corkboard at the hardware store, $250 a month, utilities included, no lease required. I took it because I needed somewhere to land, and because the owner didn't ask many questions, and because at that particular moment in my life, not being asked questions felt like the closest thing to mercy I could find. I picked up part-time barn work at a private stable about 12 miles out. The owner knew enough about horses to pay me fairly, and enough about people to leave me alone. I showed up, I did the work, and I drove back to the apartment and sat with everything I was slowly piecing together. What I knew for certain was that I hadn't opened that medication room, hadn't sedated Orion, hadn't touched the cash envelopes from the fundraiser. What I also knew was that knowing the truth and being able to prove it were two entirely different problems. Mallory had posted a statement on Willow Bend's social media the morning after the fundraiser. She hadn't used my name, she was too careful for that. But she wrote about an employee being suspended following a safety incident, and she expressed how heartbroken the Willow Bend family was to make such a difficult decision in service of protecting the children they served. Within 48 hours, every person in the regional equine therapy community had read it and understood exactly who she was talking about. 2 program directors I had worked alongside for years stopped returning my calls. A third told me directly, in a voicemail she clearly hadn't meant to leave, that her center couldn't risk the association while the situation was still under review. My parents had cut off my access to everything at Willow Bend. The client files, the donor records, the internal email system. My father sent a single text message telling me not to contact staff members, framing it as a matter of procedural integrity during the internal review. My mother didn't text at all. I had known them my entire life, and I understood what their silence meant. They had made their choice, and they were waiting for me to accept it. I didn't accept it. Instead, I started making phone calls. The surveillance company that had originally contracted with Willow Bend was still in business, operating out of Lexington. I explained that I was a former employee trying to understand the scope of the system that had been installed on the property. The representative was polite but unhelpful. The contract had ended years ago, and without authorization from the current account holder, there was nothing they could share. I thanked them and called the equipment manufacturer instead. A technician there told me that the model installed at Willow Bend in that era had occasionally been configured with a local backup drive as a secondary failsafe, but that recovering data from one would require someone who understood the original setup. He said the configuration varied by installation, meaning the person who had physically built the system would know things the documentation didn't capture. That brought me back to Russell Beck. Russell had left Willow Bend about 2 years before the fundraiser after a budget dispute with my father. My father had rejected Russell's proposal to upgrade the maintenance infrastructure, including the surveillance system, and when Russell pushed back, my father handled it the way he handled most disagreements, by making it personal and then making it public. He said something dismissive at a staff meeting that Russell wasn't meant to overhear, and Russell heard it and gave his notice the following week. They had not spoken since. I had no direct way to reach him, so I tracked down a former volunteer coordinator who had stayed in touch with him after he left and asked her to pass along my number. I told her it was important. I didn't tell her why. Russell called me back the next morning. I laid out everything what I had found before the fundraiser, what happened that night, what I suspected about the backup system. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he would call me back that afternoon. He did, and when he did, he confirmed what I had hoped. The camera above the saddle storage room had been wired to a local drive in the utility closet as part of a secondary configuration he had built in at the request of the center's insurance carrier. When the lightning strike knocked out the main monitor, that camera had kept recording to the local drive. Whether the data was still there depended on whether anyone had written over it, but nobody on current staff would have known the drive existed because it wasn't documented anywhere Russell hadn't personally filed. He still had copies of his technical records. He said he'd bring them. When I asked him why he was willing to help, he said he wasn't doing it for me or against Peter. He said he had spent his career doing work that was supposed to protect people, and he wasn't going to sit on information that might matter while someone else took the blame for something they didn't do. I didn't argue with his reasoning. I was just grateful. While Russell was working through the technical side, I kept following the money. I contacted 7 donors who had given cash contributions at events in the past year, the ones whose names appeared in the preliminary records I had pulled before my access was cut. The amounts they described amounts they were certain of because several had kept personal records added up to something significantly larger than I had originally estimated. We weren't talking about a few $100s slipping through administrative cracks. We were talking about a sustained, deliberate pattern of contributions being received, confirmed in person, and then never recorded in the center's accounts. Mallory had been doing this for the better part of a year. I had started asking questions at precisely the moment she had the most to lose, and she had understood that before I did. That was the thing that settled over me as I sat in that apartment going through everything I had compiled. Mallory hadn't framed me out of panic. She had done it because I was the only person at Willow Bend who was actually looking at the right things, and she had needed me gone before I looked closely enough to find proof. The night of the fundraiser hadn't been opportunistic. It had been planned. Through a lawyer who agreed to take the case on a limited basis, Russell and I filed a formal request to preserve the data on the local backup drive before it could be accessed or altered. Under the circumstances, the request carried enough legal weight that my parents were required to allow an independent technician to examine the system. My father was furious. He called it a harassment campaign dressed up in legal language, and he said so to the lawyer in writing, which told me something about how confident he felt in what any examination would find. Mallory's response told me something different. The moment she learned that someone was trying to recover footage from the property, she went to my parents and demanded the server be wiped. She said it contained private health information about the children in the program, and that allowing an outside technician to access it would expose the center to liability. She said it needed to be handled internally. She said the whole thing needed to be shut down to protect the family. My mother was in the room when Mallory said this, and something shifted. She told me about it later after everything had changed, and the way she described it was careful and a little painful. She said she had watched Mallory work through that argument and realized she was listening to someone who had an answer. Be it so before the question was finished. My mother had seen Mallory handle difficult conversations before. She was always composed, always reasonable, always slightly ahead of whoever she was talking to. But this was different. This wasn't composure. This was urgency dressed as logic, and my mother recognized the difference because she had spent 30 years running a nonprofit, and she knew what it sounded like when someone was trying to make a decision happen faster than the facts warranted. She didn't say any of this out loud. She didn't call me. But when my father looked to her for agreement, she didn't give it to him. She said that if there was nothing on the footage that incriminated anyone, then reviewing it would only help close the matter. My father was not persuaded, but Mallory noticed the shift, and I think that was the moment she understood she was losing ground she had thought was solid. The independent technician spent several hours in the utility closet with Russell's documentation as a guide. What he found was a local drive that had been recording continuously and had not been overwritten. He extracted a video file, no audio, limited frame rate. A fixed angle covering the hallway outside the saddle storage room, the door to the medication cabinet, and the corridor leading back toward the main office. It did not have a direct view of Orion's stall, but it had everything else. I made one decision before anyone watched that footage, and I made it clearly and on the record, through the lawyer, I would not view it privately. I would not be alone with it at any stage. The footage would be played for the first time in a room that included my parents, Mallory, the technician who recovered it, our legal representatives, and a contact from the center's insurance carrier. I refused to give anyone, including my father, the ability to later claim I had manipulated what they were seeing. We gathered in the conference room at the lawyer's office on a Thursday morning. Mallory came in with a composure that I suspected had taken considerable effort to maintain. My father sat across the table from me and didn't make eye contact. My mother sat beside him and kept her hands folded on the table in front of her. The technician pulled up the footage on a laptop connected to the wall screen, confirmed the metadata showing the date and timestamp, and pressed play. The hallway appeared in grainy gray tones, the timestamp in the lower corner confirming the recording was from the night of the fundraiser. For the first minute, the corridor was empty. Then a figure came into frame from the direction of the main building, moving deliberately, not hurrying, wearing a dark jacket with a distinctive pattern at the collar. The figure used a key to enter my office. Not a key card, a physical key, the kind that hung on the center's main keyboard in the supply room, accessible to anyone who had after-hours clearance to the building. She emerged less than 2 minutes later and went directly to the medication storage room. She came out holding something low against her side, partially tucked into her sleeve. She moved toward the far end of the corridor, in the direction of the barn. When she came back, she was no longer carrying anything. She crouched briefly near the medication room door. The technician froze the frame at that point, and you could see the small rectangle of a keycard being set deliberately on the floor. Then she went back into my office, came out empty-handed, and walked toward the side exit carrying 3 envelopes pressed flat against her forearm. The room was completely silent. My father was staring at the screen. My mother had one hand over her mouth. Mallory said it wasn't her. She said the footage was too grainy to identify anyone with certainty, and that a jacket and a wristband were not evidence. The technician pulled up a time-stamped photo from the fundraiser's official event documentation, a picture of Mallory taken earlier that same evening, smiling at the camera. The jacket was the same. The wristband on her left arm was the same. The angle of the camera had caught the side profile clearly enough that 3 people in that room independently said, without being asked, that the person in the hallway and the person in the photograph were the same woman. What followed happened quickly, in the legal sense, and slowly in every other way. A formal audit of Willow Bend's financial records over the previous 11 months revealed a pattern of cash contributions that had been verbally acknowledged to donors and then quietly removed before they reached the center's accounts. Mallory had been falsifying intake documentation, creating duplicate receipt records, and using the medication logs as a secondary system for tracking which events had generated the most untraceable income. The sedative she had used on Orion had come from a supply she had been skimming in small quantities over several months. Never enough to trigger an obvious shortage until I had done a full inventory and found the cumulative gap. The insurance carrier suspended the center's policy pending review. 3 corporate sponsors publicly withdrew. Parents began calling the center to pull their children from the program, not because they believed I had done anything wrong. Most of them had heard enough by then to understand the fuller picture, but because they no longer trusted that Willow Bend's leadership had the judgment to keep their children safe. My parents had been publicly supportive of Mallory's work for over a year. That endorsement now sat in the public record, and it was not a comfortable thing to read. My father called me the evening after the footage review. He said he and my mother wanted me to come back. He said Willow Bend needed me, that I was the only one who understood the horses and the program well enough to stabilize things, that the center would not survive without someone the community could trust. He said all of this as though it were a practical matter, a staffing problem, something that could be resolved with the right offer. I listened to the whole thing, and then I told him I would call him back. I sat in my apartment above the feed store in Georgetown, in the quiet, and I thought about what it meant that the first time my father had acknowledged my value out loud was the moment he needed something from me. And I thought about the fact that the footage had proven I was telling the truth, but it hadn't changed the night it happened. It hadn't changed the way he looked at me across that room, or the words he chose, or the fact that my mother had stayed silent while I picked up my things and walked out alone. The truth had arrived. I just wasn't sure yet what I was going to do with it. I called my father back 2 days later. Not because I had decided to go back to Willow Bend, but because I had decided there were things that needed to be said out loud in a room with both of my parents present before anything else happened. I told him I would come to meet them, and I told him to make sure my mother was there. He said, of course, whatever I needed, they would be there. The eagerness in his voice was something I had to sit with for a moment before I could keep speaking. We met at the house, not at the center. My mother had made coffee that nobody touched. My father started by laying out what he was proposing. Full operational control transferred to me, a formal public statement acknowledging that the internal investigation had cleared me completely, a restructured board with independent oversight so that what had happened with Mallory could never happen again. He spoke for several minutes, organized and specific, the way he always was when he wanted to appear reasonable. When he finished, he looked at me like a man who had just offered a fair settlement and was waiting for the handshake. I told him the offer wasn't the problem. I told him I had never wanted control of Willow Bend as a prize to be awarded or withheld. I had wanted to do the work, and for 7 years I had done it, and the only thing I had ever asked in return was to be treated as someone whose word meant something. My father started to respond, and I kept going because I had waited long enough, and I needed to finish. I said that Mallory had taken the money and drugged Orion and put my key card on that floor, and those were her choices and her crimes. But what happened next, the part where he stood in front of 200 guests and called me a liar, the part where not one question was asked and not 1 minute was taken to consider that he might be wrong, that wasn't Mallory's doing. That was his and my mother's. My mother set her coffee cup down very carefully. "I know," she said. It was the last thing I expected her to say, and the way she said it, without qualification, without a pivot to explaining her own position, told me she had been sitting with this for longer than the past 2 days. She said she had known something was wrong before the footage review. She said she had seen Mallory's reaction when the data recovery request came through, and she had recognized it for what it was, not a woman protecting the center's privacy, but a woman trying to stop something from being seen. She said she hadn't called me. She hadn't told my father what she was thinking. She had sat on it because she knew that if she said something, Peter would disagree, and then there would be an argument, and then the fundraiser aftermath would expand into something even more fractured than it already was. She said she had told herself she was keeping the peace. She said she understood now that she had been keeping Mallory safe instead. I told her that was exactly right. I said her silence hadn't held the family together. It had just made it easier for the person who was lying to keep lying a little longer. I said I didn't believe she was a cruel person, and I didn't believe she had wanted any of this to happen, but that the version of events where she was simply a bystander was not a version I could accept, because she had been in the room. She had information, and she had chosen not to use it, and that choice had a cost, and the cost had been mine to pay. My mother didn't argue with any of that. She nodded slowly, and I watched something move through her expression that I didn't have a clean name for, not quite grief, not quite shame, but something that sat between them. My father was quieter than I had expected him to be through all of this. When he finally spoke, he didn't reach for justification. He said he had stood in front of everyone who respected our family and called his own daughter a liar while the person who was actually lying stood next to him and cried. He said he had done that because it was easier to believe the story that was already in front of him than to stop and consider whether the story was true. He said he didn't know how to ask me to forgive that, so he wasn't going to try. He just wanted to know what I needed from them, and he wanted me to believe that whatever it was, he would do it. I told them what I needed was simple and non-negotiable. I would help coordinate the transition for the children currently enrolled in the program, finding them safe placements at other facilities, communicating with their families, making sure that nobody's treatment was interrupted because of something that had nothing to do with them. I would do that because those kids hadn't done anything wrong, and I wasn't willing to let them pay for the failures of the adults around them. But I was not returning to Willow Bend in any operational capacity, and I was not going to allow my willingness to help be interpreted as a sign that things between us were resolved. They weren't resolved. They were acknowledged, which was different, and acknowledgement was where we were going to have to start. I also told them that the public statement my father had mentioned needed to be more than a legal formality. It needed to say plainly that I had raised concerns about financial irregularities and medication mismanagement before the fundraiser, that those concerns had been dismissed and that the dismissal had been wrong. My father said he would make that statement personally in front of the staff and families who had been present the night I was suspended. I said, good. What followed over the next several weeks was difficult in the way that doing the right thing after a long time of not doing it tends to be. My father and mother held a meeting at the center, or what remained of it operationally, and my father stood up in front of the people who had watched me walk out that night and said out loud that his daughter had told him the truth and he had chosen not to listen. He didn't dress it up. He didn't soften it with context about how convincing Mallory had been, or how stressful the situation was. He said he had been wrong, and he said it in the same room where he had said the opposite, and I thought that mattered even if it couldn't undo anything. Mallory entered a guilty plea. The charges included theft by deception, falsification of business records, theft of controlled substances, and reckless endangerment at a licensed care facility. I did not go to the courthouse for any of it. I had spent enough of myself on that situation, and I didn't think watching her face consequences was going to give me anything I didn't already have. The truth had been established. Everything after that was paperwork. My parents sold a portion of their personal assets to cover restitution to the donors Mallory had defrauded, and to settle the outstanding obligations to the insurance carrier. Willow Bend closed temporarily for what they called an operational review, though the honest version of that phrase was that they needed to rebuild the center's credibility from the ground up, and that process was going to take longer than any of them had initially wanted to admit. Russell and I incorporated the Open Rain project about 3 months after the footage review. The name had come to me during one of the early mornings at the private stable where I'd been doing barn work. There's a thing in equine training called an open rein, a way of guiding a horse that suggests direction without forcing it, and it seemed like the right way to describe what I wanted the program to be. We partnered with 4 small farms and 2 rural school districts in the first year, offering equine-assisted therapy sessions to communities that had no access to a facility like Willow Bend. Russell handled equipment and logistics. I handled the clinical side and brought in 2 therapists I had trained years earlier at Willow Bend, both of whom had reached out after the public statement and said they wanted to be part of whatever I was building next. We built the program with a transparency structure that I designed specifically because of what I had watched happen. Every donation, regardless of amount or method, was logged in real time through a system that 2 independent board members could access at any point. Medication inventories were conducted weekly and countersigned by our supervising veterinarian. Safety protocols were reviewed quarterly by an outside consultant. It was more process than most small programs needed, but I had learned that the gap between a well-run organization and a compromised one was often just the absence of someone paying attention, and I intended to keep paying attention. The first year was hard in the way new things are hard, underfunded, understaffed, more need than capacity. But the families who came to us were not coming because of a name or a building. They were coming because someone they trusted had told them that Elise Merritt ran a program worth trusting, and that word of mouth built slowly and without any of the promotional machinery that Mallory had once managed turned out to be more durable than anything we could have posted online. My relationship with my parents did not resolve quickly or cleanly, and I stopped expecting it to. My mother called regularly in those first months, and for a long time the calls were short and a little careful, both of us feeling the edges of what was still tender. My father was less consistent about reaching out, but more direct. When he did, he seemed to have given up on finding the right words and settled instead for showing up, which I respected more than I would have admitted at the time. I didn't invite them into the center's operations, and they didn't ask. I let them come to the community events we hosted, and I watched my father shake hands with parents and volunteers who didn't know his history with me, and I noticed that he was different with people than he used to be, slower to speak, quicker, to listen like a man who had learned something about the cost of assuming he already knew the answer. I didn't offer them forgiveness as a gift, because I didn't think that was how it worked. What I offered was continued contact and real conversation, and the willingness to see who they were becoming rather than only who they had been. That was the most I had, and it turned out to be enough for all three of us to work with. 2 years after the fundraiser, the Open Rain Project opened its first permanent facility, a converted barn on a property outside of Versailles that a retired farmer had donated after his granddaughter went through our mobile program. We held a small opening event, nothing like the fundraisers my parents used to organize, just families and staff, and a few of the partner farms who had hosted us in the early months. I had asked Russell to say a few words, which he did briefly, and without drama in the way he did most things. I brought Orion. It had taken some coordination to arrange the transport, but I had wanted him there. Orion was the clearest through line in everything that had happened, the thing Mallory had chosen to use because she understood he was important to me, and the thing that had nonetheless survived intact, calm and steady, and ready to work in spite of everything that had been done to him. I had spent 2 years earning his trust before any of this started. That trust hadn't broken. It had just been tested by someone who didn't understand what it was built on. I led him into the main space of the new barn, and a boy who had been coming to our sessions for about 4 months walked up to him without being prompted. He was 7 years old, and he had not spoken to any adult at his school in over a year, but he talked to Orion the way kids sometimes do with animals, quietly, privately, not performing it for anyone else. He reached up and touched the lead rope near the clip, the way I had shown him, feeling for the weight of it. I stood back and watched, and did not say anything. There was a time when I would have needed someone to see that moment with me to confirm that it meant what I thought it meant. I had spent a long time living for the validation of people who had the power to take things from me, and I had kept showing up and kept working, and kept hoping that eventually the accumulation of that work would be enough to make them see me clearly. What I understood now, watching that boy and that horse in the quiet of a barn I had helped build from the ground up, was that I had never needed anyone's confirmation. I had needed to stop waiting for it. The camera footage had told the truth about one night. But the work, the years of it, the parts that nobody photographed or posted or put in a donor newsletter, that had always been the real record. It didn't need to be recovered. It had never gone anywhere. It had just been waiting for me to stop asking other people to read it and trust that I already knew what it said. If this story stayed with you, I think it's because most of us have been there in some version of it, doing the right thing quietly for a long time, and watching someone else get the credit, or worse, watching yourself take the blame. What Elise's story reminded me is this: the people who are truly paying attention will always find their way to the truth. And the life you build on the other side of being wronged can be more yours than anything you had before. If you found value in this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us here. We tell stories like this every week, stories about people who lost everything and built something realer in its place. I'll see you in the next one.